The quietest moment in my entire day used to be the 3 minutes I spent in the garage before opening the door to the house. I'd sit in the idling car, gripping the steering wheel, just listening to the engine's low purr, a sound of mechanical, undemanding life. It was a borrowed silence before I stepped back into the relentless noise of need. I was married to Leo, a man 5 years in my senior, who had been injured in a workplace accident years ago. He was chronically ill, often in pain, and relied on me completely. I didn't have a job. I was a full-time caregiver in a small, close-knit town where our story, the beautiful young woman devoted to her brave, suffering husband, was everyone's favorite tragedy. Leo was loving, deeply grateful, but the truth was, our life was a single long sentence of obligation. My identity was reduced to the helper, and every compliment I received felt like a chain tightening around my neck. I was weary, bone deep weary, but I wasn't allowed to be unhappy. Unhappiness felt like a betrayal of his suffering. I had no privacy, no space for my own fatigue or fear. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a person perpetually on the verge of tears, smiling a brave public smile. I had perfected the art of performance, but inside, I was rotting from the sheer loneliness of goodness. The first key turning point was the accidental confidant. He was Dr. Ethan Bell, Leo's physiotherapist, a calm, immensely kind man separated from his wife who drove into our town twice a week. Our interactions were professional, centered on Leo's recovery, but they were the only times in my week I felt like an equal adult discussing something complex and external to my domestic prison. One afternoon, Leo was asleep after a particularly difficult session. Ethan and I were clearing the weights, and he just looked at me, not with pity, but with a deep, knowing empathy. He saw the tension in my shoulders, the exhaustion in my eyes. He didn't ask how Leo was. He asked, "How is your sleep, Eliza?" It was such a small question, but it broke the dam. I dissolved into silent tears, leaning against the cold wall of the hallway. He didn't touch me or offer platitudes. He simply handed me a clean towel and waited. That silence, that permission to break, was the start of the emotional affair. It wasn't about sex or passion. It was about gentleness. Our conversations shifted from rehab exercises to the impossible burden of caring for another human being without losing yourself. Ethan offered me a non-judgmental ear, a space where my selfishness, my desperate desire to leave, to run, to live a life that wasn't dictated by illness, was allowed to exist. This wasn't a reckless fire. It was a warm, quiet hearth I desperately crawled toward.
The second key turning point was the shattering of the saintly image. After 4 months of hushed phone calls and accidental, profound sincerity, we crossed the physical line. Ethan was renting a small, isolated cabin on the edge of town for his workdays. I drove there one rainy Tuesday afternoon, telling Leo I had an emergency errand. The cabin smelled of pine and damp earth. When he took me in his arms, there was no urgency, no fireworks. It was a slow, deliberate act of comfort. He didn't try to awaken passion, he simply sought to soothe. The intimacy was quiet, focused, a shared moment of profound, simple release. It felt like being held without obligation, without the expectation of service or bravery. I remember the weight lifting from my chest, the sense of being, for the first time in years, completely unburdened. He traced the tense lines on my back, murmuring, "Just breathe, Eliza. Just breathe." It was the quietest, most vulnerable moment of my life, built on the biggest lie. The contrast between his gentle touch and the fierce public performance of my devotion to Leo was a dizzying hypocrisy. I was utterly ashamed, but the shame was dwarfed by the sheer, desperate necessity of that brief respite. I had betrayed my vows, but in doing so, I felt like I had finally, selfishly, saved my own sanity. The third key turning point was the unmasking in the quiet. The affair continued for a few fragile months, fueled by stolen afternoons and whispered reassurances. The guilt was a suffocating pressure, but the quiet competence I brought back home, the ability to smile and maintain the caregiver role, was directly proportional to the escape Ethan provided. The discovery came not from a physical mistake, but from a misplaced hope. Ethan, unable to continue the intense secrecy and the moral strain, informed me he was moving back to the city permanently to reconcile with his estranged wife. The lifeline was cut. I went home and collapsed. I couldn't keep the performance going. Leo, whose intuition for my distress was always sharpest when his own pain subsided, saw me sobbing uncontrollably in the kitchen. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just looked at me with a weary, knowing finality and said, "It's Dr. Bell, isn't it? The way you look at him, you look the way you used to look at me, before I was broken." I confessed everything, not for absolution, but because the truth was finally less painful than the lie. Leo didn't rage, he didn't scream, he simply cried. Not from anger, but from the realization that his reliance on me had finally pushed me past the point of return. He understood that my betrayal wasn't about finding a better man, it was about finding a space where I wasn't needed to be a hero. We are separated now. The divorce is slow and quiet, managed by lawyers in the city, kept private to protect Leo's reputation in the small town. I moved to a tiny apartment far away, starting a life where no one knows my story. I miss the simple, comforting presence of Leo, the shared history we destroyed, but I don't miss the role. Ethan and I exchanged one final email. He apologized for his own weakness and for the pain he caused. I never saw him again. I am left with a profound, aching sorrow. I am no longer a saint, but I am also no longer a captive. I shattered my life to escape a role, and now I am simply an unknown woman searching for a purpose that doesn't involve sacrifice. I often wonder, is it more noble to stay and die a little every day for someone you love, or to leave and live a life you hate yourself for gaining? I don't know the answer. I only know I can finally afford my own silence.